Morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. This is actually quite an exciting event, and I am here to introduce Dr Aseem Malhotra. And the waters are turbulent, and I'm looking forward to hear his opinions. And also, I hope the people that are here assembled will ask the relevant questions. A bit about Aseem. He was born in New Delhi in India in October 1977. The family moved to Britain in 1978 when he was a one-year-old, and his father had a clinical attachment to the Elder Hay Hospital and was studying for a diploma in tropical medicine. Both parents became general practitioners. Aseem himself developed an ambition to become a cardiologist. He was educated at Manchester Grammar School. His father went on to become the first Asian to be elected as an honorary vice president and deputy chair of the Council of the British Medical Association, and received an OBE for long-standing service to the NHS. Malhotra himself studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, graduated in 2001, and in addition to his work as a cardiologist, he has been described as a highly regarded public health campaigner. I'm hoping that he will expand his views on the COVID vaccines and his opinions on statins. And I think it's a great privilege to have him talking to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Thank you for that very, very kind introduction. It's great to be back in one of my favorite cities in the world, Cape Town, for the first time in, I think it was 2015, I was last here. Okay, so to understand the part, you need to understand the whole. So the title of my talk is Going Back to Ethical and Evidence-Based Healthcare. Strange concept, right? Ethical, evidence-based healthcare. Current challenges and solutions. And of course, within that, I will talk about my journey on an evolution of my understanding around the COVID vaccine, specifically the Pfizer vaccine. So before we start, I think one of the most important challenges we have right now is understanding that the barrier we have in getting to the truth, and this applies very much to the COVID vaccine, but can apply to many areas of medicine, is a psychological one. It's not an intellectual one. You know, the science is very clear in many areas of medicine, but getting that information and disseminating it to healthcare workers, to patients, to members of the public actually ends up being quite often a psychological one, because people have been so indoctrinated with a certain narrative, which they haven't really fully appreciated or grasped is coming from very powerful vested interests. So this book, which I read, which is fascinating, written by Margaret Heffernan, it's called Willful Blindness. And that's when human beings turn a blind eye to the truth. We're all capable of this, by the way, in different circumstances. Turn a blind eye to the truth in order to feel safe, avoid conflict, reduce anxiety, and to protect prestige and reputations. The other barrier we have, certainly in relation to the COVID pandemic, is the psychological phenomenon of fear. Many of us, understandably, and this is still true to this day for maybe a small proportion, were gripped by a fear we've never experienced in our lives when the COVID pandemic started. And I think, you know, it wouldn't be unfair to say that we're all still suffering from a form of PTSD because of that. The effects of lockdowns, you know, many people lost loved ones. It was certainly a devastating virus for the vulnerable and the elderly, and there's no doubt about that when it started off. But the problem with fear is it also inhibits one's ability to engage in critical thinking. The third psychological phenomenon, which is a barrier to getting to the truth, is that changing one's mind is one of the most stressful experiences a human being can go through. And when you look at academia and certain medical science, there's a great quote by the Canadian-American economist John Kenneth Galbraith. Faced with the choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no reason to do so, almost everybody gets busy on the proof. So let's start with that acceptance and understanding of these barriers, but I think the solutions to overcoming them is talking about it and understanding them. So what's worse than ignorance? The late, great Stephen Hawking, oh, it's frozen, not moving slides. Okay. Yes, so what's worse than ignorance? The illusion of knowledge. So I'm going to start with, what are we all trying to achieve ultimately? I've got a lot of reservations in more recent years about the independence of the World Health Organization, and I will allude to that. But one of the things I think they do brilliantly is actually their definition of health. I don't think there's a better definition I've come across. So it's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And as doctors, our primary responsibility as healthcare workers is to improve patient outcomes. This is a very elegant analytical framework that we use to practice and teach medicine, or we should be using. This has been going for, this was David Sackett, the founding father of this evidence-based medicine movement. This was published in the BMJ in 1996, so well over 25 years ago. But actually, unfortunately, we're not really implementing evidence-based medicine. So how do we improve patient outcomes, specifically treat illness, manage risks, and relieve suffering? We do that by incorporating our individual clinical expertise, our clinical intuition, experience, the best available evidence in relation to whatever we're managing, whether it's a drug intervention, whether it's surgical intervention, whether it's ordering a test, whether it's a lifestyle intervention. And last but not least, as David Sackett said, probably the most important is taking into consideration individual patient preferences and values. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if any of these components are not optimized, you're not going to improve your patient outcomes in the way that you want to improve them. And unfortunately, evidence-based medicine has become an illusion. It's become hijacked by powerful commercial vested interests. And what does that mean? If you look specifically about the best available evidence, if we are making clinical decisions on biased and corrupted information, at best, we're going to get suboptimal outcomes for our patients, and at worst, we are going to do harm. And we have a complete healthcare system failure around the world based upon a number of factors. And I call it in my paper, you know, I talk about now, we have a pandemic of misinformed doctors and misinformed and unwittingly harmed patients based upon a number of factors. Biased funding of research, so that's research that's funded because it's likely to be profitable, not beneficial for patients. Biased reporting in medical journals, biased patient pamphlets, biased reporting in the media, commercial conflicts of interest, defensive medicine, and last but not least, this is critical, medical curricula that fail to teach doctors how to comprehend and communicate health statistics. Without understanding the numbers involved, and this is not rocket science at all, it is very, very simple, like ridiculously simple. Without understanding the numbers involved, doctors, patients, and the public are vulnerable to exploitation of their hopes and anxieties by commercial and political interests. And we've seen that play out in a scale that we've never experienced before during the pandemic. Okay, so I always look to other sources. Whenever I use my clinical expertise, of course, I do my own analyses, but I always get things verified. I look at other experts in various fields. What are they saying? And in general, I try and always get, go to the scientists that are independent of industry funding. And you'll know why by the end of my talk, why I do that. But a man who I consider, and I think there's a reasonable case to be made to call him the Stephen Hawking of medicine, is John Ioannidis. Professor John Ioannidis, professor of medicine, epidemiology and statistics at University of Stanford. He is the most cited medical researcher in the world by orders of magnitude. He's an absolute genius when it comes to looking at data and reliability of data. And he published this great paper, which I really encourage you to, it's open access to read, not long, called How to Survive the Medical Misinformation Mess. And he says that most doctors, healthcare workers, don't understand the poor quality research that drives their clinical decision making, which basically contributes to the fact that, in the US, 30 to 50% of all healthcare activity brings no benefit to the patient, and contributes to overuse, over medication, underuse of maybe cheaper or more effective options, avoidable adverse events, missed opportunities for right care, and huge waste, of course, in the system. So what are the root causes behind this medical misinformation mess? So first of all, he points out much published research is not reliable. In fact, he actually published a paper not so long ago before this, where he said that it's actually entitled, in fact, it's the most cited medical research paper in history, and it's called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Much published research is not reliable, offers no benefit to patients, or is not useful to decision makers. Most healthcare professionals are not aware of this problem. This is not a deliberate, malicious attempt by our profession to mislead patients. Absolutely not. Most of us go into the profession to do the right thing. We want to do the right thing by our patients, but we are ignorant collectively of where the information is coming from that drives our clinical decision making. So not aware of this problem. Then most of us, and this is just a simple training issue, to be honest, lack the necessary skills to evaluate the reliability and usefulness of medical science. And then last but not least, patients and families frequently lack relevant, accurate medical evidence and skill guidance at the time of medical decision-making. And he says this as well in the paper. He said, ignorance of this problem, even at the highest levels of academic and clinical leadership, is profound. Now, in my own experience, anecdotal experience, working in many different organizations, influencing health policy, meeting people like the chief medical officer, the chair of medical oral colleges, having conversations with these people, you really understand when you have conversations with them, there's a huge gap in knowledge around the system failures that drive an inefficient healthcare system. This is very, very common. A couple of very quick examples. We're going to come to it further, but I remember when I'd started to really critically appraise the evidence and realize there was a big problem with the Pfizer vaccine, I spent 2 hours on the phone. I was in America at the time, at the end of 2021. And I spent 2 hours on the phone speaking to the chair of the BMA, Chand Nagpal. And I said, Chand, we've got a problem here with this vaccine. We need to do something about this at the very highest levels of, academia and health policy, and you need to speak to the Secretary of State for Health as well, as you have access to him. And I spent 2 hours speaking to him. And I went through everything I knew at that point, with the best available evidence. And I said, and at the end of the conversation, Chand said to me, he said, Aseem, nobody appears to have critically appraised the evidence, and he speaks to all people in health policy, as well as you have from this conversation on this vaccine. Wow. He says, most of my colleagues are getting their information on the benefits of the vaccine from the BBC. Now, this has been replicated in America. The chair of the CDC, Rochelle Walensky, former chair of the CDC, recently also commented, saying that her initial optimism on the benefits of the vaccine came from CNN. That CNN news report she was referring to was an almost verbatim reproduction of Pfizer's press release, right? So I'm just giving you that this is, Ioannidis talks about this, and it's very, very true, certainly from my experience. The other interesting thing he points out, so this is, again, the most cited medical research paper ever in PLOS One, and he does his own mathematical analysis to give people clues to understand the reliability of research and what can help them and guide them. And he says this, he says, the greater the financial and other interests and prejudices in a scientific field, the less likely the research findings are to be true. Think about that. Is there anything more recently that has become probably the most lucrative pharmacological intervention in the history of medicine? Right? So, I became very familiar and concerned with the over-medicated population issue as a public health crisis many, many years ago. In fact, it was initially probably triggered to some degree by a campaign started by the BMJ in 2012 called Too Much Medicine, replicated in America by JAMA Internal Medicine, called Less is More. And, just to give you a broad picture overview, and people may disagree with this, but just to give you an idea, one estimate by Peter Gosha, the former, the co-founder of the prestigious Cochrane collaboration, suggests that prescribed medications, what your doctor prescribes for you, is now the third most common cause of death globally after heart disease and cancer, because of side effects that are mostly avoidable. So I realized there was a massive problem with medical research. I've done my own, campaigning and exposure and trying to get a better understanding of cholesterol and heart disease and statins, for example. And then I tried on several occasions, because I realized the situation was so dire. I tried on several occasions to get a public inquiry on the scale of the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War. So this is so bad. And I went with mainstream media, I met politicians and whatever else. And I got my views and got people on board into the mainstream, but the inquiry never happened, unfortunately. And in 2018, I went to the European Parliament and I gave a talk entitled Big Food and Big Pharma Killing for Profit. And these are some key points that I made in that talk. First and foremost, people need to appreciate and understand that the pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies have a legal obligation as businesses to make a profit and declare a shareholder dividend by selling their product. They do not have a legal requirement to give you the best treatment, although most of us would hope that to be the case. But the real scandals are these. The regulators, the medical regulators, failed to prevent misconduct by industry, and that doctors, academic institutions, and medical journals who have a responsibility to patients and scientific integrity collude with industry for financial gain. And I said the situation has become so dire that honest doctors can no longer practice honest medicine. So what about the evidence? So what is the evidence of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of, the misinformation that they are perpetuating? So there's a paper in BMJ. Peter Gosha talks about the fact that, corporate crime is very common amongst pharmaceutical industry. So between 2009 and 2014, most of the top 10 drug companies were found guilty in the US of committing fraud for illegal marketing of drugs, hiding data on harms, and manipulation of results, totaling about $14 billion US. And the problem is, when these crimes are committed, when this fraud occurs, and by the way, why is this not common knowledge amongst everybody in the world, right? Because it's not getting enough publicity as well, is that the fines are very, very small in comparison to the profits that they make from the illegal marketing of their drugs. So they still end up making more money. And they have legal indemnity, in the sense that there's no criminal prosecution that comes across individuals involved in the companies. And actually what Peter Gosha says is it's time to introduce tougher sanctions, as the number of crimes, not the detection rate, seems to be increasing. Fines need to be so large that companies risk going bankrupt. Top executives should be held personally accountable, so that it would then need to think of the risk of imprisonment when they consider performing or acquiescing to these crimes. So I'm giving you a backdrop. Nothing has changed in the system prior to where we are during the pandemic to stop these sorts of crimes being committed again. For them, it's the cost of business. It is a cost of business committing this sorts of fraud. Be under no illusion about that. But then you may argue, well, hold on, Dr. Malhotra, what about all the amazing life-saving drugs and all the brilliant... Listen, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater here. Of course, over decades, through innovation, unfortunately, which has been stifled now in the last 20 years, real innovation, we have produced some amazing, we've had some amazing achievements in medicine. But it seems to have, most of that low-hanging fruit of the biggest achievements we've had in medicine in terms of improving life expectancy seems to have stalled probably up and by the year 2000 and really started in the 1980s, and I'll explain that further. But what I look at here is, so what's the net effect of the drug industry? So this sample was taken in France, looking at all of the almost 1,000 drugs that were approved by the regulator between 2002 and 2011. And when an analysis was done on those drugs, it was found that more than 50% were copies of old ones. So the drug companies change a few molecules here and there. They produce a new drug with a new name. They patent it. They make loads of money. And by the time people have figured it out, they've gone to the next drug. So that's a huge waste. But this is sort of most concerning. 15.6% of drugs were found to be more harmful than beneficial, in comparison to about 8% that were a significant clinical advance, from the previous drug. So more than double the amount of drugs that were approved by the regulator were found to be more harmful than beneficial. Most of it's waste. So what can you conclude from that? Well, I conclude very straightforward. If you look at this sample alone, the overall net effect of the pharmaceutical industry on society in the last few decades has been a negative one, This is not just, it's been replicated in other countries. So Marcia Angel, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, she did her own analysis looking at all 667 drugs that were approved between 2000 and 2008. Only 11% were truly innovative, 75% were copies of old ones. And one of the reasons for this as well, the system is discouraging real innovation because the drug industry spend 20 times more on marketing than they do on research and development of basic science, 20 times more on marketing. And what else does Marcia say? This is the former editor, by the way, of the highest impact, so-called highest impact medical journal in the world. It is no longer possible to trust much of the clinical research that is published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Richard Horton, editor of The Lancet, who came to my talk, very similar to what I'm giving today, came to my talk in London recently. And he said this in 2015, possibly half of the published literature may simply be untrue. And this is in response to him attending a Chatham House Rules meeting with some of the most senior academics in the world in London, organized by the Wellcome Trust. And that's what he got out of that talk, essentially. He said, science has taken a turn towards darkness, but who's going to take the first step to clean up the system? Richard Smith, former editor of the BMJ, wrote in the BMJ again, just before the pandemic, about the fact that he'd attended a meeting in the UK, hundreds of academics from very prestigious British institutions around the country. And he said, how many of you are aware of a colleague in your department that's committed research misconduct, has fabricated data? A third of the audience put their hand up. He asked them, how many of you reported it? They all put their hand down. Okay. Cultural. I'm getting to, listen, I'm a root cause analysis person. So we're getting slowly to the root of all of this to understand what's going on here, right? Because unless we address the root cause of this problem, which I'm alluding to now with you, any solutions that we offer are going to be flawed. This is one of the most extraordinary cases of research misconduct. It just gives me goosebumps, whenever I mention this in lectures. So one Dutch cardiologist, cardiovascular researcher, was fired from his university in Holland for research misconduct and fraud in relation to the use of beta blocker drugs, very specific indication, by the way, beta blockers in non-cardiac surgery. He influenced European Society of Cardiology guidelines, scores of papers he published on this, and it was found that it was all fabricated, it was all fraudulent, and it caused harm, and he got fired. And then an analysis was done by Darryl Francis, cardiologist in London, that suggested, just because of this fraud, there may have been 800,000 excess patient deaths in Europe over about 10 years. 800,000 deaths from one man's fraud that we know of. I'm not just a public health advocate, I write articles, I publish in medical journals, but I also believe in the importance of having conversations with people behind closed doors as well. I believe in private advocacy. It's not necessarily always the most effective, but it's important to have those conversations and you learn a lot of things. By 2015, I was then now consulting for the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. This is the organization that represents all doctors in the UK. Royal College of Physicians, Royal College of Obstetrics, Royal College of Pediatricians, etc. And I sat with all the Royal College presidents. And I think a lot of it is, to be honest, was also influenced by the BMJ. The BMJ has a big reach and big impact. And I said, listen, it didn't take long for me to convince them that an over-medicated population was a massive public health issue and a public health crisis. And that, well, what do we do about it? And I convinced them, and I got the chair of the Medical Royal Colleges and the editor of the BMJ at the time, Fiona Godley, to meet. And I said, why don't we do a joint campaign to support the BMJ? I think we'll help each other and get this. So I was a lead author in this paper, published, you can look it up in the BMJ, including the chair of the GMCs on there and the chair of Medical Royal Colleges, so very eminent doctors, to launch this campaign. And one of the things and it was basically covering some of the issues I've already discussed, right? And one of the issues as well we mentioned is that if there are so many things we're doing in medicine that only have marginal benefits or even no benefit, they're outdated, we're also creating huge waste in the system. And certainly the National Health Service, one doctor's waste is another patient's delay. I trained as an interventional cardiologist. If we're spending 2 hours in a cardiac catheter lab doing a stent on a patient that one isn't going to have his longevity improved or prevent a heart attack, and we don't tell them, and we're spending 2 hours with all the staff and radiation. I've been in this situation so many times where even a patient clearly didn't need a stent, and I was a junior at that time, you know, and one of the responses I had, I remember when I was in the cath lab with one of my consultants, I won't name the hospital, and maybe he just thought I was of a different type of culture or background or whatever in terms of my values. And we were putting a stent in a patient that really didn't need it. But I was a junior doctor, and I was like, you know, do we need to do this? And he kind of smiled at me. He goes, you know, he said, Aseem, do you know, as interventional cardiologists, he was smiling, we're the investment bankers of medicine. Listen, we have to address this. This is a cultural problem. This is widespread. We need to talk about it. We need to talk about it. Okay, this is a really important slide. And I think this is where we get to breaking down the numbers of the vaccine. I think we're getting there shortly. Really, really important to understand. Misleading health statistics. So there are different ways of presenting a benefit. You can use something called relative risk, or you can use absolute risk, also known as the numbers needed to treat. So bear with me on this. It's not difficult. If you use relative risks, then it will exaggerate for both doctors and lay people the benefits. It will exaggerate the benefits of an intervention, overestimate it. So for example, if you look at the randomized controlled trial data, yeah, caveat, industry sponsored, whatever, but let's just say, accept it to be truth. If we look at the randomized controlled trial data on the use of statin drugs in people with type 2 diabetes who are at high risk of heart disease, for example, it tells us that you're 48% less likely, depends how you phrase it, 48% less likely to have a stroke over a 4-year period. That sounds quite impressive. Imagine a patient comes in, I'm with the patient, says, oh, you know, if you take this pill religiously every day for the next 4 years, you're 48% less likely to have a stroke. Oh, wow, that sounds pretty impressive. Is it that impressive? Well, what does it actually mean, relative risk reduction? So if you look at the trial on which this figure comes from, basically, the randomized trial, instead of 28 in 1,000 people having a stroke followed up over 4 years, it took a dummy pill, didn't take the statin. And you compare it to the people that did take a statin, there were only 15 in 1,000 that had a stroke, right? So if instead of 28 in 1,000 having a stroke over 4 years, you've now got it down to 15, right? 13 less have had a stroke on a baseline of 28. So 13 over 28 times 100 is 48%. Yeah, relative risk reduction. But what does it actually mean? You've actually prevented 13 people having a stroke out of 1,000 people that you've treated. All right, 1.3%. Yeah. Another way of phrasing that is 1 in 77. This is what we call the numbers needed to treat. So what we should be doing, a more honest way for that individual patient to understand their benefit, is to say to them, and this is what by the way, I do this all the time. I do this all the time, especially when the data is available, we do that, right? When the data is available, we do that. I do it with statins. What we should be saying to the patient is, if you take this drug religiously every day for the next 4 years, there's a 1 in 77 chance it will prevent you having a stroke. I remember talking to one of my junior doctors in hospital. You know, this is a cardiology SBR, you know, passed postgraduate examination first time, you know, high functioning, whatever. And I said, we were talking about, I think there was taking a patient off warfarin for atrial fibrillation who was at risk of falls or whatever. And my God, I said, well, no, hold on, let's break it down. Let's understand the numbers properly so we can have an informed discussion. And she just looked at me blankly and didn't really get it. And then she went away and read up and said, oh my God. You know what she said to me? She said, we can't tell patients the truth because they won't take their pills. No, but just think about that culturally, right? Understand that. Now, what about mismatched framing in medical journals? So if a treatment reduces the risk of developing a disease from 10 to 7 in 1,000, but increases the risk of disease, as in the harm, from 7 to 10 in 1,000, the journal article will report the benefits of relative risk, 30% relative risk reduction, but the harm in absolute risk terms, 0.3%. It's exactly the same. Extraordinary. A third of articles published in the BMJ, JAMA, and Lancet between 2004 and 2006, so just a sample that was looked at, used mismatched framing in their reporting. This is not medical science, this is not ethics, this is marketing. JAMA, BMJ, the Lancet, right? Think about that. Extraordinary. Unacceptable. Unacceptable. Now, don't just take my word for it. The world-leading researcher on statistical and health literacy, Gerd Gigerenzer, a World Health Organization bulletin, 2009, look this up. He said this: it is an ethical imperative that every doctor and patient understand the difference between absolute and relative risk to protect patients against unnecessary anxiety and manipulation. In other words, I would argue, if your doctor, if we're not having this conversation with patients and breaking things down into absolute terms, this is unethical practice of medicine. Nobody, by the way, I've given this lecture all around the world to lots of different people. Nobody has challenged me on that. And in fact, we even quoted this in the BMJ paper in Choosing Wisely. It is unethical practice of medicine. If you have the data that's available and you don't tell the patient absolute benefits, it is unethical. But what about the evidence? Well, okay, so my junior doctor colleague said, but the patient won't take their drugs, they could drop dead. Yes, they could, but what does the evidence tell us? When you have these conversations with patients, the data that's been up to date, that's looked at this, does not show any negative impact on patient outcomes. It doesn't. Interestingly, when you tell patients and give them more informed decision-making, they tend to choose less treatments, they tend to have less surgical procedures, right? But it doesn't have a negative impact on outcomes, and of course it will save money, and it will allow you to direct resources in other areas. And of course, we can talk about lifestyle too. That's another big problem that's missing in medicine, is the attention given to the alternatives that people can also try, which is through lifestyle interventions. We're going to digress slightly and then come back to medicine side. So just very early on, I figured out, like many of you I'm sure did, that there was a clear link between obesity and poor metabolic health and adverse outcomes from COVID. So once you exclude the elderly, the biggest risk factors were really in relation to excess body fat. And I got very frustrated, and I was constantly trying to get on the news. And I did, after several attempts, I got stuff in newspapers, I published in the medical journal on it, and then I wrote in European Scientist. And it was the elephant in the room. Everyone was talking about it, but they weren't able to break the mainstream. People in America were talking, how did you get, break the mainstream, etc. And I'll come on to that as well. And this is relevant because when we think about what alternatives did we have to the current narrative about let's wait for a vaccine, let's lock down or whatever else, the thing that was missing from the conversation through public health messaging consistently was, this is a great opportunity for people to change their diets, because and I wrote a book about this, even within a few weeks of people, say, cutting out the refined carbohydrates and the sugar, your metabolic health markers improve massively. You can actually reverse what we call metabolic syndrome, which is also the single biggest cluster of risk factors linked to heart attacks and heart disease within just 4 weeks of changing diet. 50%, some studies have shown that you can reverse metabolic syndrome. I was very frustrated. And also when you look at the literature, and I did a good research on this, even historically, it's something we kind of maybe intuitively knew about as medical doctors, but we didn't really talk about or fully comprehend until the COVID pandemic started. Historically, you look at people with type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, yes, they get more chest infections, they get more pneumonia, you're more likely to be sicker. So improving metabolic health isn't just good for preventing you getting diseases like Alzheimer's and heart attacks and strokes. It also will probably quite significantly improve your immune resilience, if you like, as well. And just to give you some figures on this, if you had metabolic syndrome, you were almost 5 times more likely to be ending up in the ICU with COVID. There was a very interesting study done in the UK Biobank study during the original Wuhan strain, by the way, the more lethal strain, to give you an idea. And people in their 50s were looked at, middle age roughly, and they compared people who had the worst metabolic health. So we're talking about obese, smoking, sedentary people with the people who had optimal metabolic health. And if you had optimal metabolic health, your risk of being hospitalized with COVID at the very beginning, during the worst strain, being hospitalized, not dying, was about 1 in 1,500. If you're an obese sedentary smoker, it was 1 in 300. It's a 4 to 5 difference. Really important to appreciate that. We'll move on from that. So then I eventually, after publishing in a journal, after writing about this and talking about it in various places, I had an article featured on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. And in that, I also mentioned, by this stage, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, you may remember, was in hospital with COVID. And I knew indirectly, I knew Boris and people that knew, because I used to be an advisor on the London Food Board when he was Mayor of London. And the chair of the Food Board came up to me one day and said, Aseem, you've got to help me with Boris. I said, what is it? He says, she said, I'm really worried about his weight. He's going around cycling around London, but he's so overweight and this is not healthy. So I knew he had issues with it. He'd been, I think 18 stone or something. He'd talked about it. And once he, we've got to do things compassionately. And once he was discharged and he was doing fine, I also mentioned it's likely Boris also probably got admitted to hospital because of his weight. Why are we not talking about this elephant in the room? And also the fact that ultra-processed foods in the diet are a big driver of this problem, which is something we haven't combated. We have a fast pandemic that's exploited a slow pandemic disease. And then after that article in the Telegraph, I was suddenly on BBC News, and I've done a lot of work with, as an activist and campaigner over the years, getting on mainstream. So BBC, and then on Good Morning Britain. I was speaking to Susanna Reid and I think Piers Morgan at the time. And I mentioned the Boris thing. I just said it briefly. I didn't realize it was then going to become headline news in the Times the next day. And actually after this, it was interesting. Matt Hancock, the Secretary for Health at the time, I'd met Matt before because I'd spoken in Parliament about type 2 diabetes. He'd read my first book and then lost 2 stone. So he kind of trusted me a little bit on the diet stuff. And he said, Aseem, what should we do? What would you suggest we do about it? I said, Matt, think about what we did with tobacco and addressing it through regulation. We need to do the same thing with the food industry. So I basically had an email exchange with him, and he kind of acknowledged it. And then the Times then did a story not long after that saying that, and I'd kind of got that into the public domain by that point. Johnson to launch war on fat after virus scare. A lot of good things in this article, a lot of rhetoric, but none of it's really been implemented. The most meaningful stuff hasn't been. So this is, typical of politicians. They can often say the right thing, but we need to judge them more on their actions than what they say. And then, of course, we then found out March 2021, ultimately, those assumptions that we made have been proven to be largely correct. 90% of the COVID deaths are in countries with very high obesity rates. So that means basically 90% of deaths from COVID happen in countries where more than half the population were either overweight or obese. This is also important to understand. If another pandemic comes along in the future, hopefully it won't happen anytime soon. This is one of the best ways we can reduce, make the population more resilient so that we don't even have to consider the possibility of lockdowns happening. Okay, let's get on to the vaccine. So my background on this, despite being a staunch advocate of exposing the excesses and manipulations of the drug industry, I never in my worst nightmares conceived of the possibility of a vaccine doing any harm to the body. Certainly not the heart. I wasn't convinced about the efficacy, but I didn't think there would be any harm. And in January 2021, I had 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. I volunteered in the vaccine center. There was a bit of pressure from my father, who was the vice president of the BMA at the time. Where I was the last surviving member of his family. We lost my mum a couple of years earlier. I think he had a very smart, wise man, but he had, like many older people, he had a grossly exaggerated fear around COVID. And we're emotional beings. He was worried about me, even though I was low risk. I'd done all the analysis about COVID, and he was like, Aseem, please, please, please have the vaccine. And I actually did it not because I thought I was at risk. I also made the assumption, which we now know is wrong, that I was going to protect my patients. I have the vaccine, I'm going to protect my patients. I did. We do that in medicine. We all do this stuff. I've got scars on my arm. So many of you here have had many vaccines to protect patients from getting infection. So that's why I had it. And then a friend of mine who's a film director called Gurinder Chadha contacted me, and she at the time was receiving what I thought was, in quotes, and pardon me using this language because I actually have now tweeted saying I think it's derogatory. I think we need to use this term in the same way we use racist terminology and treat it that way. I was being sent, in quotes, anti-vax stuff. And most of it was just, it didn't have any legitimacy. I looked at it in detail, a conversation. I said, I couldn't really get convinced there was a problem here. And Gurinder rang me, and she's diabetic and she's overweight. And I said, Gurinder, you're higher risk. I think I'm not worried about harms here. I think it may do some good to have the vaccine. She tweeted it out, and then Good Morning Britain got us on to actually tackle why there was talk about why was there vaccine hesitancy, particularly amongst people from ethnic and minority backgrounds. Now, I know that from South Africa as well. There is a history here where there is definitely more vaccine hesitancy amongst the non-white population. And I went on there and I just said it very clearly. I wasn't pointing fingers. I wasn't saying these people are crazy or mad or the unvaccinated, none of that stuff. I just said, listen, there are rational concerns for vaccine hesitancy, and there are irrational, not people are being irrational, irrational concerns. I said the rational concerns is look at what the drug industry, I think they weren't expecting this. I said the pharmaceutical industry has been committing fraud for years, guys, right? So I can understand why people are hesitant. But I also said, of all the pharmacological interventions we do in medicine, vaccines are amongst the safest, for sure. And I still believe that to be true amongst traditional vaccines. And that's what I said. And that was really where it ended. And then a number of things happened over the next several months. The first thing that happened was a friend of mine who's a cardiologist, who I consider to be one of the brightest cardiologists in the country. He literally is, I would call him genius level, very, very smart, very high integrity. He meets me in his late 30s, and he meets me for a walk in April 2021. And he says, Aseem, I've got to tell you something. I said, what is it? He says, I've not had the vaccine. COVID. I said, really? I said, oh, tell me why. I'm curious. It's a very normal conversation. We said, listen, one, I did immunology as part of, when I was at Oxford. I've asked some of these leading researchers, there's a few uncertain questions that haven't been answered that I've messaged them. He said, the other thing is I want to wait and see. And third is I'm low risk. He said, but Aseem, I looked at the supplementary appendix of the original Pfizer trial, and there's something there that really concerned me. I said, what's that? And he said, there were 4 cardiac arrests in the vaccine group and 1 in the placebo. Small numbers, didn't reach statistical significance. He said, we agreed. I said, yeah, listen, this could be just by chance, of course. But he said, Aseem, but if this is a real signal, there's going to be a problem. I really hope I'm wrong, but I think there may be a problem. If this is a real signal, I'm going to wait. July 26, 2021, my dad's in Manchester, I'm in London. He calls me up, and he's a GP, I'm a cardiologist. We both probably suffer from a bit of health anxiety and hypochondriasis. So I'd call him for my health issues, and he'd call me for his. He'd reassure me, and then I'd reassure him. Yeah, some of you may be familiar with this stuff. And but this time when he called me, remember, 80% of your diagnosis comes from the history. Let's go back to the basics here. And he calls me up and he says, I've got central chest discomfort. And I said, oh, okay. I was a little bit like, oh, this doesn't sound right. I said, Dad, it's probably nothing, but you need to call an ambulance because we did an ECG on you straight away. So we had a conversation. He was a bit reluctant to call an ambulance, and he wanted to call his neighbors who were doctors at the local hospital, both consultants, an anaesthetist and hematologist. So I said, fine. And I said, okay, but you really need to call 999. So there's a bit of back and forth. And then, and I called one of his friends and I said, you must go to him now, just, be with him. I'm a bit concerned. He didn't sound like he was having a massive heart attack. He just seems like a bit sweaty, central heaviness into the shoulders. Okay. My dad, by the way, was a very, very, very fit guy, very, very fit guy, very healthy. Anyway, I called back. I went for a shower. I said, I'm going to get in the train to come to Manchester, because I knew that even if he was admitted and there was nothing on the ECG, they'd keep him in for 12 hours, do a troponin, to check for heart attack. And so I got in the shower and I came out, and it's really bizarre. I mean, this is separate, but I remember the last thing he said to me on the phone before I got in the shower. He said, Aseem, just to let you know, my will is in the drawer. And I just thought, no, what are you talking about? Don't be, you're being a melodramatic Indian here, all right? Don't be so melodramatic, And anyway, I called back, no answer. And then eventually, and I was getting worried now, the consultant hematologist answered the phone, and she was hysterical. And she said, Aseem, your dad's had a cardiac arrest, we're doing CPR on him. And I went into cardiology mode and said, listen, did you witness it? She said, yes, 2 of you there. I said, he's really lucky, he'll be fine. Call the ambulance, witness cardiac arrest. Chances of survival here are over 50% in this circumstance. Ambulance didn't show it should have come in 8 minutes. I said it didn't show for 30 minutes. They put the heart monitor, I FaceTimed. They put the heart monitor on, it was asystole. There was nothing to shock. He was gone. They carried on for 20 minutes. I told them to stop. It was just, at the time, it was very shocking. And the first thing I did is I did an investigation. This is relevant to the cultural problems we're talking about. I did an investigation myself. I thought, what's going on here? And why is there an ambulance delay? Is this an anomaly? Is it random? What's going on? Because he should have been saved. He should have survived. And when I did that investigation, I found out in that process, someone very senior linked to NHS England, the government, a senior nurse actually, who knew my dad. She rang me and she was in tears and said, Aseem, I'm really sorry, but the Department of Health and the government knew across the country, in every region, that the ambulances are not making it for emergencies in time. They're taking 30 to 40 minutes. But they deliberately chose not to tell the doctors and public about this. Okay, and that would have changed things, because we wouldn't have called. And she said, Aseem, my own husband, a week earlier, came home from playing football and had chest pain. I didn't even bother. She's a senior nurse in NHS England. She said, I didn't even bother calling the ambulance. I got him in the car and drove him down the hard shoulder of the motorway to the nearest A&E. They diagnosed an acute myocardial infarction. He had emergency stenting. He was fine. So she felt really guilty. So I contacted a cardiologist I know, who was one of the good guys. And I said, well, I'm writing about this and just want to make you aware. This is going to come out in the news, and it's going to probably kick off. It's my, and he said, Aseem, I wouldn't do that if I were you. You're only going to make yourself enemies. And I said, what about our duty to patients? No reply. I ended up publishing it, of course, and it became BBC News headlines, etc. So there's a cultural issue there. Okay, I was still confused. Why did my dad have a cardiac arrest? So I organized a post-mortem, and I was thinking he may have just had a small plaque rupture, no significant coronary disease, and then a plaque rupture and arrhythmia. You know, we know, by the way, I've done research on this as well and published on it, that there is no correlation with the size of the heart attack and whether or not you're going to have a cardiac arrest. So if you have a heart attack and have a cardiac arrest and are successfully resuscitated, your prognosis is the same as someone who has a heart attack that never has a cardiac arrest. Okay, so there's no correlation. It can be random. So I organized a post-mortem. There was no heart attack, first of all. There were 2 severe narrowings in his arteries, critical stenosis. I thought, this is odd. What's happened here? And the reason why it was odd is I knew my dad's cardiac history very, very well, only a few years earlier. Well, other than the fact that, you know, I consider myself quite athletic. I do a lot of activity, and he beat me for the first time playing badminton in a singles badminton game, and it was really intense, and there was no symptoms. But also, just prior to that, we'd done some routine cardiac screening tests on him. And he didn't have any significant coronary disease, not even close. So there'd been a rapid progression. So for me, I'm thinking, what's caused this rapid progression? This is my area of interest, my area of research. It doesn't make sense. At this point, I had no idea. We get to October 2021, and 3 things happened that made me think, okay, I need to go public with this now. The first thing is an abstract was published in Circulation, where there was now a plausible mechanism of how the mRNA vaccines can cause rapid acceleration of cardiovascular risk. Stephen Gundry, following up hundreds of his own patients, found that the risk within up to 10 weeks after having the vaccine of having a heart attack over a 5-year period went from 11% to 25% in 8 weeks. That's huge. That's huge. One bit of data, fine. But if it's even close to being true, we've got a problem. We've got a problem. I then get contacted by a whistleblower at a prestigious university, researcher, cardiologist, and said, he was very upset, and he said, it seems something I've got to tell you. I said, what is it? He said, the researchers, you know, that I'm working with have accidentally found from coronary imaging, so this is completely separate to blood tests, there is coronary inflammation in relation to the mRNA vaccine, but not there in the unvaccinated. And he said that we had a closed meeting, and they said, we're not going to publish these findings because it may affect our funding from the pharma. Right? I also, within that period of time, get contacted by a journalist and said, Aseem, we've got this, you know, you're an expert in heart disease. There are reports coming from several hospitals in Scotland of a 25% increase in heart attacks, unexplained. I was like, God, okay, there's more than enough here. So I went on GB News, and I went, you know, and I said, listen, these are the, and I did it in a very scientific way, I felt, you know, I was very measured. I said, listen, we've got these bits of data. It's a signal. We should investigate it. That's all I did, right? And the reason I'm mentioning that is after this, the amount of behind the scenes, I would use the word attacks that happened to me were extraordinary. So one prestigious institution, which I won't mention, that I've worked with closely, got contacted and sent me a letter saying, basically a number of anonymous doctors had accused me of being an anti-vaxxer. I'm spreading anti-vax misinformation just by talking about what I've been told, right? And I needed to respond to them. One of the organizations I'm involved with also had issues, and I thought, bloody hell, this is not going to be that straightforward. I can't just go out on Twitter and start tweeting stuff. People are getting cancelled. What can I do here? Because it seems like a problem. So I spent 9 months critically appraising the data. And I reached out to people at Oxford, Stanford, Harvard, immunologists, vaccine specialists. I didn't do this on my own to verify, you know, information that I was putting together. And I thought the only way, and by this stage, I'll be honest with you, by December, and I was going around privately telling people, don't have any more of these jabs, because I'd realized what the benefit and harm was at that point. But it wasn't published. And I said, I thought the only way that we're going to overcome this battle, or it's not easy, but I have to try and get this peer reviewed and published somewhere. And then I would, you know, be an advocate for that information. And I published it, and it's actually a journal that I think originates in Cape Town. Interestingly, it's called the Journal of Insulin Resistance. It's open. So why did I publish it here? It's open access journal, doesn't get funded by pharma. It was the only journal that was going to allow me to write 10,000 words because I had to walk people through the journey, right? And then I also had to explain why we got it wrong, how we got it wrong, where we need to go, what we need to do moving forward. So I published it there. So the first thing I did was I went back to the original trial. So let's just break down this data. Okay, bear with me here. So I went back to the original trials that led to the approval of the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, okay? Publishing the New England Journal of Medicine. And I wanted to look at the absolute risk reduction. The reason I didn't look at that at the beginning is I expected there to be a reduction in transmission. But by that stage, we knew for whatever reason, whether the virus evolved, maybe it was never going to stop transmission anyway, right? That's debatable. And even if it did stop transmission at the beginning, it certainly didn't do it after a few months. So what did the original trial show in terms of prevention of infection? Because many people, even health policy people, didn't know this when I spoke to them. That original trial that led to the approval, remember this gold standard, double-blinded, randomized controlled trial, showed no statistically significant reduction in COVID mortality. It showed no statistically significant reduction in all-cause mortality. If anything, in terms of absolute numbers, more people died in the vaccine group than they did in the placebo. Okay? But it did show a 95% relative risk reduction in prevention of infection. What did that mean in absolute terms? This is peer-reviewed and published, and it was, cited. No one's, has combated this. 1 in 119. So from the beginning of the very rollout, what should have been told to us was there's a 1 in 119 chance if you take this vaccine, it'll prevent you getting an infection. Okay, that's the first thing. We'll come on to, by the way, other people may say, okay, hold on, Dr. Malhotra, yes, it doesn't prevent infection, but we know it prevents serious illness and death. And you're right, but let's just go through that in a second. The second thing, which I wasn't aware of, I'd presumed if antibodies were generated from the vaccine, because I even got tested, and I remember tweeting something out not longer after I went on Good Morning Britain and said, oh, this is a relief. There's antibodies, I'm protected. I didn't know about this. In May 2021, the FDA put this out. You can look this up. The US FDA is reminding the public and healthcare providers, did you know this, by the way, because I didn't, that results from currently authorized SARS-CoV-2 antibody tests should not be used to evaluate a person's level of immunity or protection from COVID-19 at any time, especially after the person has received a COVID-19 vaccination. Okay, what about the benefits, right? I'm a numbers guy. This is the only country in the world that I think has published this so far. Only recently in the UK, per million vaccinated, per million unvaccinated. They broke down the figures, right? This is non-randomized data, fine. So it might be better or worse than this. But what they found was this, okay? If you had 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, if you're over 70, the highest risk group, you have to vaccinate 2,500 people to prevent 1 severe hospitalization of COVID. 5,700 if you're 60 to 69. If you're under 60, 18,700, then you're getting into tens to hundreds of thousands of people need to be vaccinated to prevent a severe hospitalization. Now, you could argue if there was no harms at all, okay, you treat the many to benefit a few. But still, this is very, very poor. And remember, other traditional vaccines, we eradicated smallpox because these vaccines, if you vaccinated 100 people, 95 of those people would not get the infection. This was never going to happen with COVID, not even close. And what does Ioannidis think? So I went back to Ioannidis and thought, well, what does Ioannidis think? Am I going down the wrong track here? And he actually makes in his paper in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine, first of all, he says, for these observation randomized designs, we need transparency of the data, and obviously they need to release the raw data. That's a big problem. We haven't got the raw data from Pfizer. But he also says that what we need to be doing, we need meaningful comparisons of benefits and harms of different vaccination strategies on absolute risk scale. So Ioannidis is also saying the same thing. So I was my attempt in this paper was to get as close as possible to the truth on what are the absolute harms and what are the absolute benefits, okay? Slight digression, because remember, a lot of people's information on COVID, and even now, when you look at heart attacks, is coming from the mainstream media. So this paper in JAMA basically revealed that most healthcare stories reported in the United States, I'm sure it's replicated around the world, did not fulfill criteria for accuracy. Okay, most healthcare stories, most of them at all, not even close. Here's an example. I remember only a few months ago, this headline in the Times, I don't know, you may have received this in South Africa as well. Are you ready for this? Even mild COVID linked to heart disease and strokes. Even mild COVID linked to heart disease and strokes. Headline in the Times. So I went to look at the paper on which that headline was based, right? And what did they find? Well, they found people hospitalized with COVID, by the way, during the original Wuhan strain, within a month, had an increased risk of heart attack and stroke. Not rocket science there. A lot of people who got hospitalized with COVID already had cardiovascular risk. Even with other infections, you get an increased risk of death within 30 days of leaving hospital. Not that surprising, but let's be very specific. They also said there was no link with mild COVID and heart attack and stroke. There was no link between mild COVID and heart attack and stroke. There was a link with pulmonary emboli, but not heart attack and stroke. Hold on, that's the complete opposite of the headline. What else did they find? On the left there, it says, In our main analysis, we found an unexpected association of COVID-19 with lower risk of heart attack in the non-hospitalized subset. So, okay, not plausible, but still interesting. If you had mild COVID, according to their research, you were less likely to have a heart attack. This is the other thing they also mentioned in the conclusions. They basically said we did not account for vaccination status that could have influenced the findings. So imagine that, complete, just ridiculous, horrible. Can we trust the regulators? Well, BMJ investigation found, and again, this is something else that the chair of the BMA didn't know, many of my colleagues. They didn't even believe when I told them that, did you know our regulator in the UK gets 86% of its funding from pharma, the FDA gets 65%. Donald Light, who's a sociologist, writes this. I think this is I would agree with this in its entirety. Can we trust the regulators? He said, it's the opposite of having a trustworthy organization independently and rigorously assessing medicines. They're not rigorous, they're not independent, they are selective and they withhold data. Doctors and patients must appreciate how deeply and extensively drug regulators can't be trusted so long as they're captured by industry funding. Okay, let's get on to the harms, right? I've said to you before, no one would, I'm sure, disagree with me here. The highest quality level of data is a double-blinded randomized control trial, yes? Reanalysis that was done by very eminent scientists, Peter Doshi, associated with the BMJ, Joseph Freeman, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, published in the journal Vaccine, right, the most impactful journal for vaccines, published in Journal Vaccine. They were able to get new information from Health Canada's website and from the FDA's website to do a reanalysis on the data that was available and look at the harms from the vaccine. And what did they find? The first thing is this: the original trials that led to the approval of the vaccine, you were more likely to suffer a serious adverse event, hospitalization, disability, life-changing event from taking the vaccine than you were to be hospitalized with COVID. Now, on the surface of that, for me, that suggests this vaccine should never have been approved for anyone in the first place. The original trials suggested more harm than good. And if you look at, this is another thing which is extraordinary, the WHO put out a list when the vaccine was being approved of potential serious adverse events that could happen, I'm not saying they will, could happen because of the vaccine, based upon the technology that was being used, other data from animal studies, theoretical information, and even COVID itself. Severe COVID and a lot of the complications of the vaccine are related to the complications you see with severe COVID as well, okay? And look at this list. It is absolutely extraordinary. I've been managing patients with vaccine injuries as well. Anything and everything that can go wrong with the heart is on there. Heart failure, arrhythmias, cardiac arrest, myocardial infarction, myocarditis. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. Now, remember, the most important tool you have in medicine is your history taking. Always listen to the patient. They're not always right, but often they will give you the answer. Now, this is not high quality evidence, but it's interesting. This was published in BMC Infectious Diseases recently, a survey in America to figure out what could be the rate of serious adverse events, hypothetically, based upon talking to people who felt they'd been vaccine injured or knew someone that had died or had a vaccine injury. And they estimated that because of the COVID, just in America alone, during 2021, the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine was the main one, could have been responsible for 278,000 deaths and 1 million serious adverse events. So the serious adverse event rate may be as high as 1 in 300 from that, and the death rate may be as high as 1 in 1,000 people taking the vaccine. Now, the reason why I think that's plausible is because the randomized controlled trials, the drug industry often design the trials because they know people who are less likely to get side effects, and therefore that 1 in 800 figure is likely underestimated when you then take it out to the real population. So the people in those trials were healthier, okay? The second thing is that 1 in 800 figure is only at 2 months. And we know, and there's autopsy data to confirm this now, that the vaccine can cause sudden cardiac death several months after having a dose. My dad had his cardiac arrest 6 months after having the second dose. And for me, with everything I know, I think the most likely explanation for his death and his rapid progression of coronary disease. And what does that mean for me is that when I say this cardiologist, that means even then I thought, okay, we're going to see excess deaths and coronary deaths increasing for several years now. People that may be having a heart attack in, say, 20 years are suddenly going to have a heart attack in a year, for example. What's the mechanism of harm? Have we got a plausible biological mechanism? Yes, we have. So we thought we get injected in the arm, the spike protein stays there, generate antibodies, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we know now that the spike protein gets distributed in every organ system in the body and can stay there for up to 4 months. The brain, the heart, the kidneys, the liver, the ovaries, the testes. It either causes a direct toxic effect to those cells and those tissues or an autoimmune reaction. Observational data also, high quality observational data from Israel. They found a 25% increase in heart attacks and cardiac arrests in people aged between 16 and 40. Associated with the Pfizer vaccine, not associated with COVID. There's a very, very ugly picture being painted here, isn't there? So just to get through this, I know we're a bit short of time, but really, you know, we know there's no protection from infection now. And also, it's really, the other thing that's really interesting that I came across after I published my paper, which I didn't know about. So if we accept this at least 1 in 800 figure of serious adverse events, we have pulled other vaccines for much less. Swine flu vaccine 1976 was pulled because it was found to cause Guillain-Barré syndrome in 1 in 100,000 people. The rotavirus vaccine was pulled in 1999 because it was found to cause a form of bowel obstruction in kids, affecting 1 in 10,000. This is 1 in 800. It's a no-brainer. I'm sorry. I'm ready to argue anyone, any place, anytime, and get them to tell me why we should. So it should never have been approved, but it certainly shouldn't be continuing to be rolled out. And we need to understand why now. And this is where we're going a bit further. Okay. So root cause analysis. Let's go back into understanding these system failures. This is a great definition of the commercial determinants of health. Strategies and approaches adopted by the private sector to promote products and choices that are detrimental to health. How do big corporations affect our health and health policy? Okay, quite a busy slide. I'll just summarize it for you. They have multiple dimensions of power. Okay, power over decision-making, control of the political agenda, campaign donations, lobbying of politicians that control policy, mandate, think about mandates. Okay, preference shaping. So they will capture the media, and the media are, a lot of them, certainly in America, and many are subtly controlled by big corporations. So they define the dominant narrative. Philanthropic organizations. You look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Huge influence. Second largest funder to the WHO now is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Heavily invested stocks in pharmaceutical industry, McDonald's and Coca-Cola. Bill Gates Foundation alone has made $500 million purely in investing in these vaccines. You know, and he's basically controlling a lot of the agenda. They shape the knowledge environment, funding of medical education, funding of medical research, the legal environment, limited liability, unregulated activity, which we know about. And they got this indemnity. They got immunity from many governments around the world that if people got vaccine injured, they are not going to be liable. Our governments allowed this to happen. India didn't, and Pfizer left, but many countries gave them this liability, which means if people are vaccine injured, those companies are not liable, right? Unless they are found to have committed fraud. And I think the circumstantial evidence at the moment suggests to me that that is a very strong possibility. Okay. So corporate power really needs to be the public health priority. Just to give you an example here, I've talked about the issue of fraud and research misconduct. This is quite extraordinary. So John Abramson was interviewed by Joe Rogan. John Abramson's a colleague of mine. He's at Harvard. He's been involved in a lot of drug litigation over the years. And he talks about the Vioxx scandal. Vioxx was a drug in the late 90s, early 2000s that was marketed because it was thought to be better than ibuprofen because of less stomach problems with ibuprofen as an anti-inflammatory. Excuse me. Eventually, it was found that it doubled the risk of heart attacks and probably was responsible for the death of 60,000 Americans. And it was pulled, and Merck were found guilty of committing fraud and fined $950 million in 2011. Okay. Now, during the process of litigation, internal emails were exposed, and John Abramson talks about the fact there was an internal email around the time of the drug after it was being approved and it was being marketed and rolled out from one of the chief scientists of Merck. And this is what the internal email said. It's a shame that the cardiovascular effect is there, but the drug will do well and we will do well. What do you call that kind of behavior? Have you got any words to describe it? Any thoughts? Anyone? Any words to describe that? Crime, criminal. Okay. So I've come up with this new term, although it's derived, it's an evolution, called the psychopathic determinants of health. So we've got the commercial determinants of health at the root of the problem, but I think further up or linked to that is what we call the psychopathic determinants of health. Robert Hare is a forensic psychologist. He was behind the original international classification DSM criteria for psychopathy. And in the book, The Corporation, written by law professor Joel Bakan, and in the documentary, he actually says, and he refers to pharma, by the way, in this, he said quite often, not always, quite often, as an entity, I'm not talking about individuals in the companies, as an entity, as a legal entity, in order to make profit, they behave like psychopaths as an entity. What does that mean? Callous unconcern for the feelings of others, incapacity to maintain enduring relationships, reckless disregard for the safety of others, deceitfulness, repeated lying, and conning others for profit. People who are enlightened with the information that we have already, and they come to me and say, Aseem, what's going on? This is crazy. It's crazy. Yeah, it is crazy. You can explain it rationally. It's a downstream effect of the psychopathic determinants of health. And if we are allowing ourselves, Tony Fauci kept saying, trust the science, which, by the way, is the most unscientific statement I've ever heard in my life. Medicine has never been an exact science. It's an applied science. It's a science of human beings. It's an evolving science. It's a social science. It's not an exact science. So that was also unscientific. But when he said trust the science, what he was saying, in effect, I don't think he meant this. I'm not saying he meant this, but in effect, what he was telling the whole world, trust the psychopath. Trust the psychopath. And we know what that has done. There's been problems getting information out on social media. I've been suspended several times on Facebook. And then I found out in my own investigation that Merck are the people controlling or having a big influence on what counts as health misinformation on Facebook. Merck, Vioxx, yeah? Happy with that? Acceptable? No, absolutely not. I myself, there's a personal story here as well. Because of failures in this system, I've lost both my parents prematurely. My mother had big problems with ultra-processed food addiction, was overweight, had lots of problems with arthritis, rheumatoid, had a horrible death. And then when she died, because of the system was under so much pressure, they couldn't get treatment to her in time that she could be relieved by her pulmonary edema. She was in crashing heart failure. They waited 2 hours while my dad and his best friend sat by the bedside because the hospital was too busy to give her furosemide, right? So she suffered unnecessarily when she died. And my father, of course, was the ambulance day, which you know about, also because of these failures in the system, because we have not tackled the root cause of this problem that's been going on for many, many years. The two big industries, which I call enemies of democracy, because they deliberately suppress the truth, feed us misinformation and harm our health, are big food and big pharma. And without addressing those two enemies of democracy at the root cause, this problem is only going to get worse. And it is getting worse. We are regressing in terms of our health, psychologically and physically. What do we do? Okay, I'm here to offer solutions too. As an advocate, there's this approach framework that was developed in Thailand called the triangle that moves the mountain. So what do we do here? Well, first of all, we have to create the relevant knowledge. It has to be clear, concrete, it has to be independent, it has to be as truthful as possible. You then disseminate that information and you start a social movement. That can be through mainstream media or social media. Again, it's challenging, of course. And then the political involvement will happen both ways, right? The politicians listen to the public, the politicians are influenced by the media. That's really the strategy, really, that I think that needs to be thought about when we engage in this. And then as a public health advocate, Simon Chapman was a professor in Australia, professor of psychology, who's considered the lead campaigner in bringing back tobacco control. And he talks about his 38-year career on that process, and he gives us some very key lessons, right? But one of the things he also mentions as well, which is relevant now, is that careers are often built on lifetime commitment to a particular phase of evidence. If the evidence changes, it is absolutely critical for public trust and the integrity of public health that we acknowledge the facts have changed, and accordingly that we have changed our minds too. Our patients are very forgiving. If things change and mistakes happen, we tell our patients, this is what we're told to do. This is ethical medical practice. I'm really sorry, there was a mistake committed here. This is why it happened. We are going to do our best to make sure this never happens again. I've spoken to many doctors privately who are fully on board with what I'm saying, but they won't speak up publicly. And one of the first things they said to me is, oh God, Aseem, what are we going to tell our patients? Just be honest with your patients. Just be honest. The longer we go on keeping this from them and not being open and honest about it, the problem is only going to get bigger, and there will be chaos initially, but it's just going to be a lot worse if we keep this from them and don't tell them the truth. So the key points in terms of public health advocacy, and this is what I'm working on hopefully in South Africa as well here, is media attention on a public health issue is often more effective than private advocacy. Sunlight is a very potent disinfectant for malodorous health policy. And there's no more potent sunlight than getting an issue major media attention. Advocacy must be evidence. We must be evidence-based and clear in what we're saying, speak out publicly, use killer attention grabbing facts. You place them in the context of a value system. You know, we have to connect with people's hearts as well as their minds. Use social media. And this is also crucial. Grow a rhinoceros hide, because as soon as your work threatens an industry or an ideological cabal, you will be attacked, sometimes unrelentingly and viciously. Okay, so you have to be thick-skinned. It is not safe to speak the truth, right? But it's less safe to not speak the truth, because the problem only gets worse. So you have to have a thick skin. And I've had my fair share over the years. When I first started, you know, I remember I collaborated with, it's great to have Tim Noakes here, with Tim at the very beginning when we started realizing there was a big problem with sugar. And he helped, he gave me a quote for the press release on that I published in the BMJ. But the amount of attacks that happened to me that was going on, even government agency bodies trying to not allow me to speak in hospitals when I was talking about sugar as a major issue, all of the lobbying behind that. So you've got to be prepared that you will be attacked. But it's, you know, ultimately, we're fighting for humanity here and for the truth, and it's worth it. And then most recently, I went on the BBC. So this was quite difficult, the vaccine stuff. I've got many colleagues and friends in the BBC and they were saying to me privately, "Aseem, we can't get this story past our editors. We don't know why." Some of them are vaccine injured themselves, by the way. These are journalists. Now, by accident, well, I don't know by accident, they asked me to speak about statins. A chief medical officer, we've got excess deaths in the UK going on. And the chief medical officer came out and somebody said, "It's because people are not taking their statins." Now, I'm a statin expert, right? I'm not saying this is a self-indulgent thing. I've spent a lot of time looking at the benefits of statins and breaking it down. And although it's possible, it was very unlikely. And then Carl Hennigan from the Center of Evidence-Based Medicine did an analysis. There was no reduction in statin prescription. So this was just false. So why is he doing this? Why is our chief medical officer, by the way, he's not a cardiologist, who's advising him to say this? So they asked me to talk about statins because NICE had then about 2 weeks later come out saying we need more people on statins who are low risk. I thought, this is odd. Dr. Malhotra, can you come on at short notice to talk about statins? Sure. I went on BBC and I said, yeah, this is about statins. But by the way, there's a big issue of excess deaths here. I just want to tell you something. There's something else you're not talking about. It's a vaccine. I went on BBC, it went viral, right? I'm glad it was a mainstream media here. I knew that there would be a backlash. And then the Guardian, who I've written 19 opinion editorials for over the years, then did a hatchet job on me, okay? Cardiologist, BBC critics of letting cardiologists hijack interview with COVID, you know? And there was all sorts of smears. One of the quotes was even saying, "I'm not a cardiologist." So this is what they do, right? That's fine, you know? And then also I was part of a grooming gang of anti-vaxxers. And they said as well that I had compared the rollout of the vaccine to the massacre of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, which I never did. I talked about willful blindness and gave some examples of that in my talk, of the concept, including Hollywood and Harvey Weinstein, for example. You know, what can happen? We're all capable of this. This is a concept you need to understand. And then I said, one of the barriers we have is around the vaccine. That's it. So they put all that together. But for me, I was actually quite happy when this happened. I was expecting this to happen. I knew when this happened, we're making progress. You know, because as Gandhi and other Mandela and people taught us, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. So this is a sign of progress. We're having that discussion, right? What should we do moving forward? Very basic things here. There's lots we can do, but there's some things that are really important. Although the drug industry plays an important role in developing new drugs, they should play no role in testing them. All results of all trials that involve humans must be made publicly available, and the regulators should not be funded by the industry, okay? Enough of this. This is not ethical, it's not scientific, and it's not democratic. I speak to people all the time. I speak to taxi drivers, people in the coffee shop, my patients. I say, do you know this? And do you find this acceptable? Absolutely no way. Remember that the general population don't know what's happening, and they don't even know that they don't know. What should we do? Well, we need to focus on the corporation, refocus our research programs, reframe our way of thinking about the corporations, think about the commercial, the wider determinants of health, what's really affecting population health. Okay, and we need to address that at this route and redesign. Lincoln, although apparently this is misattributed, but he gave a similar quote, but Lincoln predicted this. This is something that's been going on for a long time. "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." The late Robert Kennedy, you know, we need to think about going back to the culture that we're in at the moment in terms of what values, what do we hold important? What happened to basics of integrity, honesty. This is what we should be doing as healthcare workers. We adhere to these oaths, but are we really, really practicing them? And Robert Kennedy says that the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. So we have to go back to thinking about living the virtuous life as well. Ancient wisdom teaches that. We need to have, we are losing access to the truth and our capacity for empathy, and that combination is terrible for society. Why is it important to speak the truth? Because if people speak the truth and you believe people are speaking the truth, people trust each other more. And for societies to function and to progress, we have to be able to trust each other. And we can't do that if people aren't speaking the truth or feel that it's not safe to speak. This is very, very negative for us. So we have to think about that, go back to those basics, right? So these are, think about being virtuous of all the virtues. Courage is the most important, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. Okay, so as Gandhi said, ancient wisdom, if you like, as well, taught us this: it's health that is the real wealth, not pieces of gold and silver. We should rise up against this organization of misery. And remember, rights are only won by those that make their voices heard. Thank you very much.
First, thank you very much, everybody, and also thank you very much, the speaker. I wish I could speak as fast as you could.
That's me going slow, by the way. So
there's something called empiricism. It's the theory that all knowledge is based on experience derived from the senses and by observation. And the result of that is one of two things. On the one side, dogma, the other side, science. And I think science is the side we should be always preferring rather than the dogma. But we have to weave our way very carefully through science in order to get the right answers, because that in itself is a challenge. I really thank you very much for a fantastic talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mohammed. I don't know if there's time for Q&A.
I'm sure Aseem will handle them better than I do.
I don't know if you have a wandering mic or you can just.
Have you got a wandering mic?
Oh, and this? Well, actually, maybe. Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Years from the low carb, all of that made a huge difference in our business. I don't disagree with you in any way with what you're putting forward with steps forward, but I think we also have to be aware of how the concept of evidence-based medicine in itself has been hijacked. I'm a PhD student with my university based in the States. I spent 14 years in the States. I'm speaking mostly from that environment. But if you look back to the early 2000s, when we were really operationalizing this concept of evidence-based medicine in the States, the people at the table were not doctors. It was the health insurance industry, it was the pharmaceutical industry, it was the hospital industry. And so we have this concept in the States of evidence-based medicine where doctors follow the protocol created by experts, supposedly on the evidence, which is what we're seeing come to bear with COVID, right? The experts are corrupted.
Yes.
The evidence is corrupted. So the question is who controls the evidence? But then we also have doctors being told that they mustn't listen to their patients, right? They mustn't make decisions based on their own personal experience and their own patient outcomes, because that is not reflective of the evidence. So in a way, we have universalized medicine and the human body, yet what we are also poignantly aware of is how individual everybody's body is. Yet that's not easily commercializable, and so we universalize it. But in the States particularly, what's happened is you have disciplining of doctors. So if they don't follow protocol, and doctors practicing defensive medicine, where even when they know that this is not what they would ideally want to do to protect themselves from litigation, they will do it anyway. But you also have doctors being, before COVID, risking losing their license, and patients, where if patients refuse, particularly parents of children, parents of minors, and family members of the elderly who are then determined not to be able to make their own medical decisions. You have the rights of patients taken away from them. Parents get prosecuted. Doctors get called child protective services on parents. And so it's this incredibly difficult field to navigate. I mean, my own primary care physician has had to, has told me he's had to go to court to protect his patients. I've been threatened with having child protective services called on me because I objected to a planned intervention that wasn't actually evidence-based. So the problem is so extensive, trying to actually get grips with it is very difficult.
Yeah, thank you. Completely agree with everything you're saying. So, you know, the problem is we have unjust and unethical laws that are allowing this to happen. And if I went further into the roots of it from an economic perspective, this problem really started in the 1980s. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, maybe well-intentioned at the time, introduced this neoliberal economic model. And what that meant was that they gave more power to the industry, both visible and invisible unchecked power, not fully appreciating that the industry would become a monster and become psychopathic in many ways. And then everything else that you've talked about is absolutely the downstream effect of that. So if we're going to change the system, we have to change the laws so that this sort of stuff doesn't happen. You know, and one of the things Martin Luther King said, it's a moral duty of every citizen to disobey unjust laws. That's not easy. You know, I've had my fair share of stuff going on behind the scenes, you know, complaints to the General Medical Council, whatever else. I knew when I published this paper, when I went out with it, I was there and people were saying to me, Aseem, you're going to get struck off. You're going to lose your medical license. And I thought to myself, is this so important? Is it worth doing that? And I didn't hesitate. I went out with it. We need to be more courageous. And if we're in groups and we speak in groups, it's much, much harder and we disseminate that information. They isolate us. And that's where the problem lies, right? So the dissemination of information, working together, working in teams. And I think we're making good progress. I think certainly the Western world, we've seen the US and the UK. There's a big disconnect between what's going on in terms of the population and what the government are telling us in terms of vaccines. People are not taking them anymore. Word of mouth. Everyone I speak to knows of someone who either been seriously vaccine injured. Even here, I was speaking to somebody, a taxi driver. I was in India recently. I mean, what's happened there is extraordinary. We suspended the AstraZeneca vaccine in most European countries in 2021. India carried on with it under the name COVID Shield. No one really knew. And there are people, it's extraordinary and really sad. People coming to me crying, widows, lost their husbands to sudden cardiac death. It's beyond criminal what's happened. It is horrific. But we have to try and understand it at its root, and we have to try and have conversations in a compassionate way with people who aren't enlightened, because ultimately I do honestly think most people want to do the right thing. They just need the information.
We keep on talking about a pandemic, which seems to be based on inaccurate and unreliable PCR tests. Now, I don't know what happened in the other countries in the world, but in South Africa, the death rate in 2020 was lower than any previous year during the pandemic. So what actually happened?
Yeah, honestly, you know, there's problems with the PCR testing, false positives and that kind of thing. I think one of the other issues is that we found after the original wave was that many people were being told were dying with COVID, but not of COVID. So that also exaggerated grossly the numbers. I think the UK figure was something like only 10% of people that were in the figures of dying from COVID actually died purely because of COVID. So there's so many areas, you're absolutely right, that need to be looked into on that, for sure. And we also know, by the way, that I'm not sure, younger populations would have lower mortality rates anyway from COVID, right? This was predominantly a virus that was devastating in older and vulnerable groups. and certainly we get to children, John Ioannidis' own analysis of this said it's less problematic in children than the flu is. There's a 1,000-fold gradient difference in risk depending on your age.
Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. Aseem, really enjoyed it. The corruption of science that you speak about seems to me to be an inevitable consequence of centralization of medicine, of science in general. Are you seeing any promising innovations that might allow us to look forward to a world characterized by less centralized science? Any promising movements that we should be backing to help us get there?
Yeah, we've seen that, Nick. I mean, this is something we need to do a deep dive on to understand what the best way forward is. Some people have suggested we have alternate movements and alternative healthcare systems. I don't think that's productive. We are ultimately we're all interconnected. Social inequality is getting worse, is really bad for population health as well. Bad for social cohesion. You have more crime. All these sorts of things happen. I very much believe in the centralization, right? In terms of the evidence base, what we should be fighting for is making sure that people get information that is freed from commercial influence when it comes to their health, as independent as best as possible. And then we let the individual doctors use that information to have conversations with individual patients based upon their preferences and values. That's what needs to happen. The problem we've got is we've got this collusion, we call it centralization, but also it's corporatism. It's a collusion between governments and industry. But the people that are really pulling the strings aren't the government, it's the industry. So that's what I think we need to address at the root cause. That's my view, but very open to chatting further about it with you.
Yeah.
Sorry, query regarding, my name's Stephen Trine. I'm just a normal average Joe, okay, and I'm not a medical professional or anything like that, but I just feel that donating blood and stuff like that, if you've been vaccinated, would have a negative effect on an unvaccinated person. I have personally confronted the Western Province Blood Transfusion Services numerous times on this issue. I get the same narrative that you get from corporate that you got when you were fighting this. They say there's nothing that will never harm anyone and all of that. But I saw from the vaccine, I'm in the military, within 2 weeks of them, we started vaccinations on our base, 4 people died. Okay, that is why I did not take the vaccine. What is your opinion on the spreading of the COVID spike protein in blood?
For that, it's a great question. Other people have asked me the same question as well. So the honest answer is we don't know. I think in medicine as well, if a patient has a preference and they say, listen, I don't want, blood from someone that's vaccinated, I think they're well within their rights to say that if that's available. My personal feeling is I don't think it's an issue. I think what will help though, I think Ryan Cole, pathologist, who's a friend of mine in America, has done a lot of work on autopsies on people and finding spike protein in various tissues. I think he's developing some sort of test that hopefully will allow people, even people who've been vaccinated, to see, is there spike protein still circulating in their bloodstream? So that I think will help evolve the situation further. But the honest answer is we don't know. Tim.
Thanks for a fantastic lecture, as always. But I'm just going to make the most controversial suggestion. The most conspiratorial theory. And so it doesn't go beyond this room. Okay. In answer to your question, sir, you asked, where did the COVID pandemic come from, etc. You have to understand that virology is a hypothetical discipline. It's got baseline hypothesis that has never been proven. And the hypothesis is that there are things called viruses which they can get into your body, they can then regenerate and kill you and then transmit on other people. None of those steps has ever been proven independently. We, the scientists, just accept it and we accept it. Just to remind you that in the 1918 flu pandemic, there was no transmissible agent ever identified. But there was a massive vaccination of millions of people around the world. So ultimately, there might not have been a COVID-19 pandemic. It might have been something else rather than a virus. Now, I'm not saying I believe it. All I'm saying is that we need to look at the evidence very carefully and decide, is it true that this hypothetical virology is true or is it not? One of the problems why virology is not a science is that they do no controls and they do no blinding. And those are two requirements for science. You have to be blind to what you're looking at, and you have to have control experiments. In all the experiments where they say there's a virus present in this particular specimen, they do not do a control to see whether, when they don't add what they believe is the virus, is causing the problem. So that's all I'm saying. I'm just raising the point.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think it's important to critical thinking is necessary, because I know there is a school of thought that also feels, I'm not saying you believe it, but have mentioned that before. One thing we do know now, which clearly contradicts what we were told, is we were told this came from a wet market in Wuhan. And it's very clear now, the evidence tells us this actually came from a lab in Wuhan. That was a joint American-Chinese lab, and Anthony Fauci had a role to play in that as well. This gain-of-function research. So the most plausible explanation, if it is a virus or not, is this escape from a lab, and then they covered it up. That in itself is horrific enough.
I'm not a medical person. I was a patient. I had the COVID injections, vaccination, and I had my heart tested. And the doctor in another province, Gauteng province, said that my heart was the heart of a 55-year-old person. And and I was born in 1955. Wow. So I was very chuffed with myself. And then I had a knee replacement done, and everything went well. The same day I could walk on that. I was always healthy. I went to gym 5 times a week from Monday to a Friday, 6 o'clock in the morning. I was in my gym. So I go off, and then I have a pain in my back. I go off to another hospital, and they keep me there 17 days in ICU, and I still don't know why I was there. I come out, and I have a lameness in my arm, which I never had before. The doctor tests my heart. He says I have a tear in my heart, and that the mitral valve is not working properly. I went in with no problem. But in the interim, I had 2 Pfizer injections and 1 booster. And I timed them. When listening to you, I'm so glad I came. Listening to you, the time frame fitted perfectly into what happened to me. And I was angry about it. I sat here, I angry. So sorry. 1 second, I'll be back in a minute. What I wanted to say was, I have 2 grandchildren, and one is going to be 2 in a few days' time. And I kept myself as healthy as possible. When I was in my 70s, I saw that I did everything right. I ate properly, exercised properly, and I maintained myself so that I could spend time with my grandchildren. I wanted to see them grow up. I wanted to pass on to them what I knew. And I
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and welcome to Cape Town.
Thank you.
So I focus, so it's going to be conspiratorial, I focus more on the conflicts of interest. I'm a medical biologist by profession, but I decided, after I convinced myself about the fraud that was perpetrated, how did they do this? So for the South African people, I mean, we have just been subjected to a humongous fraud. And it goes all the way to the top, right? And so we have a regulatory authority, a SAHPRA, South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, It's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's funded by the Clinton Health Access Initiative. It's funded by the CDC. When you go into the CDC, they beautifully hide their interests. They've got a CDC foundation, which is actually a corporation, and it's funded by all of Pfizer and all of these. And then what we have is, in our country, we have a National Department of Health, right, that goes into partnership with these guys. You know, they go in partnership with, they've got a 10-year agreement with CDC, right? And they're all funded by Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, all of them. The NICD, National Institute of Communicable Diseases, you know, run by, headed by Lucille Bloomberg and co. So the South African government appoints a ministerial advisory committee on COVID-19. And more than 50% of the individuals that were chosen to be on the board, including the overarching chair, Professor Salimah Karim, is fully funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And of course, for that, dumping us into this situation, he's appointed to the World Health Organization Science Panel, 9%. So this is the kind of fraud that is going on, you know. So I don't know how, you know, we're going to fix this, because the rot is right through the system, you know. And we you know, when you look at the World Health Organization as well, and you go international, each and every one of them is totally, I mean, like, give you an example. The World Health Organization has got a funding regime, right? That they got two types of funding: assessed contributions and voluntary contributions. 80% of the funding to the World Health Organization is voluntary contributions, right? But voluntary contributions means that the entity has full say how the money is spent. And guess what? Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is the second, you mentioned it.
Yeah.
So if just in ending, we have a system that is completely and utterly fraught with corruption.
Yeah.
I mean, just ending, that's a brilliant book and brilliant documentary, Corporation. Everybody must watch it. This guy, one of the stockbroker investors, makes a statement and says, you know, when there's a disaster, or when there's, in this case, disease, and it was a global disease, and I agree, it's not a pandemic, but we laugh all the way to the bank. And so, I mean, I just thought I'd add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, yes.
Because we are YouTube and music, we've got two online. This one was, how long after you have been vaccinated are you in danger to get an adverse effect? And the second question was,
So what do you do? More importantly, I've been double vaccinated myself. At the moment, there seems to be a reasonable evidence to suggest that most people, not everybody, who are vulnerable to side effects from the vaccine are the same people that are vulnerable to COVID. You know, there's some chronic inflammatory synergy going on with the vaccine that also causes the problem. So and I'm managing many of these vaccinated people myself.
Please, can everyone just bear with us while we try and get the venue back online? The internet seems to have dropped. Sorry all, please just bear with us. It seems like the venue's internet has dropped with load shedding, so we did only have the venue until 9 o'clock. We are trying to get them back on. We will keep you updated. Just give us a second. Okay, unfortunately, the venue, as we only had it till 9 o'clock and load shedding is now kicked in, we are going to have to end the stream. But please feel free to contact the person that sent you the invite. The contact details are on the invite with any further questions, and I'm sure they'll try and get back to you. Thank you all very much.